Hi everyone, welcome to Tales of Dread. We will go back to Russia during the time of the Soviet Union to learn more about a story about a Cold War event that allegedly killed a number of Soviet soldiers. Smaller groups of people just call it the plane in the forest. As the transport struggled through the cloudy sky, the young lieutenants tried to look away from the faces of the men sitting around him in the cramped cabin of the plane. Despite all their training and varied experience from previous missions here and there, he could still see faint signs of fear in their faces, given that the base commander had given them orders that morning. Maybe this wasn't a big surprise. Several days before, a reconnaissance flight that flew over the Paranar Plateau reported seeing a single plane sitting on the ground in the middle of a forest. When they got back to their base, the flight pilots did the right thing and turned in their report, which was then matched to an internal bulletin about a missing military plane. The lieutenant and his group had been told to search the area, which was close to the slopes of Mount Carmel. The paratroopers knew that the huge distance between the crash site and their air base was the maximum distance that their helicopter could travel. With the mission parameters they had been given, there wasn't much room for error. If something went wrong, they could end up as alone as the people they were trying to find. They had been told to investigate, and if he was honest, their commanding officer was just as worried about the same questions that were on everyone's mind. What was a military plane doing in the middle of nowhere? It should have been able to fly over that distance. Having made what seemed like an impossible landing in the middle of a dense forest, and, perhaps more importantly, what had happened to the men who were in it. In previous episodes, we looked at different times when ships and planes went missing in remote places like the Bermuda Triangle and the Great Lakes. These have included the loss of Flight 19 and the French minesweepers in Common and Sorry Souls, neither of which has been solved. In other parts of this series, we've also talked about times when planes and ships were found with their entire crews dead under strange circumstances. The most famous case of this is when the Orang Madin was found. A ship was found floating in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Everyone on board showed signs that they had died from being scared. During our Enemy Unknown episode, we heard about the mysterious disappearance of an American B-52 and its crew during the Vietnam War. At that time, a team of US Special Forces was sent to a remote part of the war zone. When they got there, they found the plane, which seemed to have been brought down there. They found that the whole crew had been killed in a cruel and mysterious way. Even stranger was the fact that the huge plane was sitting perfectly straight in a forest where the trees were close together, without a single word about how it got there. The plane's fuselage, landing gear, and the trees that were still standing around it were all fine. It looked like an unknown force had pulled the huge plane straight down to the ground. We went on to compare this mystery to a similar story that was said to have happened in Russia during the Cold War. In that story, a transport plane was found in mysterious circumstances. We didn't know much about the details, but after that episode aired, we were contacted by a subscriber from Russia, who said they remembered hearing about the incident when they were younger. They said that it was a popular story among their armed forces and that it had been passed down through the families of those who had served in Siberia. Since then, we've gotten an email from a subscriber who now lives in the United States but whose family is from Russia. The email confirmed the story's details. It's a mystery that still hasn't been solved. Having taken place in one of the Soviet Union's most remote and unfriendly places. In the summer of 1961, a paratroop officer stationed at Volok Airfield was called to see the base commander without warning. He was told to choose a group of his soldiers who would be flown to a remote part of Siberia on a search and rescue mission. As he told his team about the scene on the way there, the young officer couldn't figure out how a plane could have landed in such a remote area, far from any known flight paths. Several hours later, He and his team were dropped off on an open area of land next to a dense forest. Their pilots told them that this was as close as they could land safely to where they were going. It would take them another hour of wandering through pines and spruces of different sizes and densities before they finally reached their goal. There had been a lot of excitement when the lead paratrooper almost ran into the metal fuselage of the small transport plane, which seemed to appear out of nowhere as his men instinctively formed a circle around it. The lieutenant was not at all unaware of the puzzled looks. Now, they were putting up the plane. Before them was an Antonov A-12, a small propeller-driven vehicle that could carry up to 12 people. It was painted in military colors and stood straight up on the forest floor, still in one piece, as if it were waiting patiently to start the trip back to its base. There were no signs of damage to the fixed landing gear or propeller, and the trees and ground around it were completely undisturbed. This seemed to rule out the possibility of a crash landing, and he motioned for one of the NCOS to join him. The lieutenant walked slowly toward the plane, still trying to understand what they had found. Both in front of and behind the Antonov were thick bushes and thick tree trunks, which made it impossible for it to land where it was or be driven into the forest, ducking under the wings, and trying the outside door. With the help of two other men, the two found out that it was locked. It would take them a few minutes to do it right. As they slowly made their way into the main cabin, they saw that no one was there and there were no signs that anything bad had happened in the cockpit. The controls were set up as if the plane was still in the air and not getting ready to land. It was also found that none of the electrical parts of the plane worked. Even though both pilots' seats were now empty and there was a half-full cup of coffee sitting in one corner of the cockpit at the base of most of the seats, their safety harnesses were still securely fastened. In the main cabin, there were weapons packs and webbing that looked just like the ones he and his fellow paratroopers were wearing. He knew that the longer they stayed there, the more his men would be affected by how strange and scary what they found was. The officer had told everyone to find all the logbooks and papers. He then took pictures of both the inside and outside of the plane before telling his men to get in a line and start the long walk back to their vehicle. Once they got back to the Volok airfield. After the lieutenant turned in his report, he was told not to talk about the mission with anyone else and to make sure that his men got the same orders. But because of how the military works, the story would eventually get out to the rest of the Soviet forces. This would lead to hard questions with no easy answers. No. People say that on the way back to base, the paratroopers read the papers they had found on the Antonov before giving them to their superiors. The copy of the flight manifest that was found in the cockpit showed that the transport plane had taken off from Vorkuta, the Soviet Union's most important airbase, a few months before for a short flight to an airfield nearby. The soldiers were getting more and more scared as they read this. The base in question was just outside of the city of Vorkuta, and was used to launch tactical bombers. The missing transport plane was found over 12,000 kilometers from both where it took off and where it was supposed to go. Not only was this well outside of its maximum operating range, so it wouldn't have enough fuel to make a return trip, but it was also nowhere near any other Soviet military facility. To put it simply, the plane shouldn't have been able to get as far as it did, and it shouldn't have had any chance of landing safely anywhere. Also, the document didn't say anything about passengers on the flight, which made it hard to figure out why equipment and weapons typical of a paratrooper detachment had been found on board. The way the Antonov was found was also strange. It was lying on the ground in perfect condition, as if it had fallen straight down from the sky. There were no signs of a fight or other trouble on board, as everyone was wearing their safety belts and equipment was close at hand. If it was necessary, it almost seemed to the rescue team as if a mysterious force had taken the crew and passengers off the plane while it was still in the air and then gently lowered it to the ground. In the years that followed, members of the team would ask about it quietly, usually when they met other soldiers who had served at the Vorkuta air base. However, they would always get one of two answers: either the servicemen they were talking to didn't know anything about it, or they were told politely that they were asking dangerous questions. Because of this, only whispers about what happened have been heard outside of Russia in the years since the story spread to small Russian communities outside of the military. Many theories have been made about what might have happened. Those who have talked about it in public have mainly focused on the idea that the crew was taken by aliens. This might not come as a surprise. People who believe in this theory think that the Antonov was taken over by aliens. The plane's crew and passengers were taken away in the middle of the flight, and the plane was then taken to a faraway place. People say that this is why the missing men didn't have time to take off their safety harnesses before they vanished from a cabin that was locked and safe. It could also explain why the accident happened while the plane was in the air, but the pilot was able to land the plane safely in a dense forest with no damage. There are reports from all over the world of situations in which vehicles and their crews seem to have had a sudden and unexplained bad luck. The Sabrina, a three-masted schooner, was found drifting off the coast of France in 1917. No one was on board, but her hull was still full of the valuable coal she was supposed to deliver. In October 1955, the ship's logbook and papers were open on the captain's desk, and the galley table was set for breakfast. However, none of the 23 people on board could be found. The MV Joy II, a commercial ship, was found in the South Pacific with all 25 of its crew and passengers missing, even though the ship was made of cork and couldn't sink. Other people have said that the idea of extraterrestrial involvement is unlikely because of how secretive and unaccountable the Soviet military was about making weapons. They think this might be another example of how the Soviet armed forces did illegal experiments without caring about the safety of the soldiers who took part. There is a lot of evidence that, contrary to the official story of the Soviet space program, many cosmonauts were put into orbit, only to die during their mission and leave their bodies drifting through space. The secrecy around the events that happened at Dyatlov Pass has been linked to military experiments as well as creepier stories like the famous Soviet sleep experiment. Even though this story is often made fun of as the work of a creepypasta, it's not impossible that there's some truth to it. Is it possible that the Antonov was carrying a technology that led to the loss of its crew, or that it was hit by some kind of portal or projected field that caused its crew to vanish? There is, of course, a much better way to explain what happened. And the reason for this is that the event is just a military version of an urban legend. It's possible that a search and rescue team was sent to Mount Carmel and did find a crashed plane there, even though it had no reason to be there since the crew was no longer there. The AN-2 is still one of Russia's most mass-produced planes, mostly because of how advanced its technology was for its time. It didn't look like it had a stall speed, so the pilot might have been able to let it coast and glide much farther than its operational range. It could also take off and land in very short distances. This means that a skilled pilot could have crash-landed it in the woods with little damage, leaving them stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get help. It's not crazy to think that the people on the plane could have flown off into the Siberian tundra and never been seen again. Some parts of the stories, like the plane being stuck between trees, the crew's safety harnesses being on, and the controls being set up for flight instead of landing, may have been made up over the years to make them more interesting. However, as time goes on, details of the more secret events that happened during the Cold War are slowly getting out to the public. It is hoped that one day, the truth will be known about things like what happened to the Izdal woman and how Commander Lionel Crabb died, as well as how an Antonov transport plane went missing in the wild and untamed Siberian landscape.